there folks, the Infinite Jukebox here with another year-end list video. I don't know if you noticed, but it is no longer 2024. There's this thing that happens like every couple of years called the New Year. I don't really know much about it, but I do know that it did happen, and it's now 2025, which means I now legally, at possible penalty of death if I don't, have to talk about my favorite and least favorite releases of the entire year of 2024. Now, I've already covered my top 20 EPs of the year, and I'd like to think that that video, no matter how tired I seem in it, is actually mildly okay-ish. But now, before I get to my top 50 best albums of 2024, aka the one that takes me the longest but I have the most fun making, I get to talk about the one that gets people the angriest in my comments sometimes, which is just as, if not more fun sometimes, and that is my top 20 worst albums. So, without further ado, here are my top 20 worst albums, and also like an EP or two, of 2024. Here you go. 20. Katy Perry, 143. You know, on one hand, I nearly want to say that this record isn't quite as bad as some people made it out to be, but also it's on my 20 worst of 2024 list, so I think you can pretty much gather my opinions on it from that alone. I mean, this is easily the most generic pop record that I heard throughout the entirety of 2024. There's just nothing going on here that has any sense of flavor, any sense of personality, which is kind of amazing considering there was a point where Katy Perry was honestly one of the more unique and individualistic pop stars when she first started to originally blow up well over a decade ago at this point. But that time has obviously long since passed, and now what we have is a pop star with no real discernible identity other than just music. I really can't describe this in any other way. There's just nothing going on here that feels interesting or unique musically, lyrically, vocally. There's just nothing here to even remotely dig into, whether it's the singles that flopped harder than maybe any other major pop star singles in 2024, or the deep cuts that don't really offer anything that would make this record something worth returning to. It's just not a remarkable album in any particular way. And again, I don't think it's the worst album of the year like some people said it was, but at the same time, it's not good. 19. Juice WRLD, The Party Never Ends. The only reason that this isn't placed higher on this list is because there honestly does feel like a few songs on here that feel relatively finished, if not fully complete, and just weaker by Juice WRLD's standards that he set for himself in his lifetime. But that doesn't change the fact that this record just feels like a massive cash grab and the milking of the legacy of a man who died at a tragically young age. It's honestly kind of disgusting to listen to this record and really anything else like it, something that really happens more often than ever should to rappers in particular when they die at unfortunately young ages, and that has remained true for decades at this point. So it's not really a surprise that this is happening to Juice WRLD, such a beloved figure in the music industry, but at the same time it is disappointing to see, and it results in a record that feels disappointing and at times just downright unpleasant from a moral and emotional standpoint. It feels like the words that come from a man who never got a chance to say them himself. He just put them down and then had a bunch of random special guest stars come in to fill the voids in unfinished songs. It's, again, just viscerally unpleasant at points, and the only reason that I can't put this higher is just because it feels like they at least plucked a few tracks here or there to maybe kind of make up some portion of this record that is mildly finished at best, but that certainly does not make up for this record's existence in the first place, let alone the fact that the songs here just really aren't that good in the first place. 18. Spice Y2K. You know, I, at one point, was kind of a defender of Ice Spice. When she first began to blow up and everyone was immediately dunking on her just for existing, I thought it was kind of a shame that no one was really giving this up-and-coming rising star a chance to shine at all, and then she put out this, and you know what? I get the hate now. This woman cannot stop doing poop bars. She cannot stop doing the same exact flow that she's been doing since day one. There's just no versatility on display here. There's really no substance here in the record whatsoever. And honestly, I think that Ice Spice is going to go the way of DaBaby and Roddy Ricch and other rappers within the past few years that have blown up and seemed like the next big thing for a nanosecond before everyone realized that they could only do like one thing and then just completely vanished into thin air thereafter. So, you know, hopefully Ice Spice has a mellow departure and not so much a, you know, DaBaby homophobia departure. But my point still stands. This record is absolutely pointless to even listen to. There's just nothing here that showcases Ice Spice's abilities at all, if she even really has them, as she really hasn't demonstrated them since she first put out a couple of singles that got her big. And again, the poop bars. Please, stop. I'm begging you. Number 17. Camila Cabo CXO. Look, I don't think anybody was expecting this record to be actually, like, good, exactly, but at the same time, considering how obvious it was that she was deriving influences from recent successes within the more somewhat experimental side of mainstream pop music, most notably Brat by Charli XCX, I think that most people, or at least myself and a few people I spoke with before this record's release, were hoping that it would at least be a fine knockoff that everybody would forget, but instead it's a boring knockoff that everybody, you know, did forget. So there's just really nothing going on here that makes it stand out from other pop albums right now, but more than that, it just feels like a ripoff of better artists. Camila Cabo has really nothing to add as a vocalist. She doesn't really have any dynamic personality going on here. The instrumentation never manages to feel particularly boundary pushing in any way, yet at the same time, it's too busy trying to be something unique and failing that it never manages to polish itself up well enough, resulting in something that can only be described as musical sludge, nothing really happening that feels even remotely distinct. The best moment here is a feature from City Girls, which is, you know, that's not a good thing. I like City Girls, but when that's the peak of your record, that's not a great sign for the quality of the record overall. And at the end of the day, I can just imagine this is the beginning of the end for Camila Cabo's mainstream pop career at the very least. It seems like nobody really particularly enjoyed this one outside of her stans and core fan base, and I can see why. There's just nothing to really enjoy here. Number 16, The Dare. What's Wrong with New York? Every time I return to this record, I feel like Harrison Patrick Smith, the man behind the Dare project, had a vision, and I nearly respect it. But it just doesn't land each and every time. In fact, it actually lands a little bit less each time I try to return to this record and understand why so many people really enjoyed it and had, you know, a deep love for it. But as a whole, I just find this record to be kind of a mess. It seems like he's sort of bouncing between trying to keep up the crassness that kind of brought him onto a lot of people's radar a while back when he put out the Sex EP, but at the same time, it also seems like he's trying to bring a more sentimental and earnest vibe to the same drug-addled club goers that, you know, are kind of the ones that are going to listen to his music at these sort of electro-clash settings. It just kind of feels like he doesn't know what the project is. It never really manages to achieve either in this really dramatic sense. The crassness and the sort of, again, more 2000s LCD sound system adjacent aggression that's being put on here, it doesn't really feel genuine. It just kind of feels a bit factory set, if you will. It's all just a bit plastic, a bit one-dimensional. The influences that are being drawn here from the, again, 2000 sort of electro-clash and new rave scenes, it just all feels like it's been done time and time again. An LCD sound system is, again, the most obvious comparison, but that feels kind of cheap to just bring them up when this feels kind of derivative of a lot of different bands of the era without actually really managing to have anything to particularly do with those sounds, resulting in an album that I can only really say is just plagued with ideas that go nowhere and results in this confused, unremarkable mess, with the only thing really being all that memorable here is Smith as a persona behind the mic, and when you have nothing to say or really do, then that kind of doesn't really matter, and it results in an album that in its best moments is unremarkable and in its worst moments is a bit laughable even. Number 15, JoJo Siwa, Guilty Pleasure. I mean, hey, look, I'm as happy as the next person with eyes and ears and all of, well, most of my senses intact, that JoJo Siwa is no longer doing the "calm as a bitch, I should've known better" thing. I'm glad that that's done with. I'm so happy. That being said, this EP is not much better. This is still still absolutely awful, including the song Karma, obviously, but the sort of electro-pop house stuff that's going on here, it just never feels like it manages to be even remotely respectable, and I hate to say that about any particular artist, especially one that's within my same age group, as I recognize that people in my age group are still trying to, find themselves artistically, myself included. That being said, this is just horrible. Some generic pop backings being fronted by an individual who has absolutely zero charisma, negative charisma even, and some horrifically bad songwriting. Again, Karma is the main offender, but songs like the title track and Balance Baby, it's all awful, man. It's all terrible. And it would be higher on the list if this were even double the length. If this were a 24-minute album, I would probably put this in my top 10, top 5 even, but it's only 12 minutes. So I feel like I'm not okay with putting it higher than some longer records that are just as bad, if not slightly worse, due to their length. But yeah, don't think I'm, okay with this one. This is a horrible EP, one of the worst EPs of the year, in fact. Number 14, Imagine Dragons, Loom. I mentioned this in the original video where I talked about this, the albums I missed in 2024 video I did not that long ago, actually, but I have a certain nostalgia for Imagine Dragons, being one of the first bands I really came to love when I was like 9. I try not to hate on them too much, and honestly, I still do genuinely enjoy their first couple of full-length projects, and their very early EPs, all of which I still think are actually pretty underrated. That being said, despite the fact that their recent material has been bad, pretty undeniably, especially the Mercury records, I never thought that anything they did was so awful that it warranted me covering it on the channel just to shit on it and then put it in a worst of list at the end of the year. I've always found a track or two that I've really enjoyed, and I've always kind of appreciated that about them, that even when they put out an album and I knew it was going to be bad, I'd find a song or two to enjoy from it. Until now, Loom is actually fucking horrible. This is the worst thing they've put out by far. This is one of the worst pop albums I've heard all year. There's nothing remotely enjoyable about this other than the fact that it's over relatively quickly. The choruses here are absolutely god-awful. They can't even pull off the stomp-clap choruses that they were able to pull off at one point. I mean, sure, songs like Believer suck ass, but at least I can remember how they go. The songs here are just completely indistinct. Dan Reynolds' vocals are all over the place, and he doesn't have any sort of distinct personality going on here. He just feels like he's kind of in a sort of wild state throughout this EP. I don't know how to describe it other than he goes between trying to be really suave at points, but it just kind of comes across as plasticky and illegitimate, and then at other points he's trying to come across as like tough and aggressive and confident, but he doesn't have the vocal style that suits that. It's kind of like trying to hear Adam Levine do that same thing. It just doesn't work for him in particular, and the instrumentals here are completely just absolutely terrible. It's all just the most bland, electro-pop oriented. It hurts my soul, man. What else do you want me to say? Moving on. Number 13, Rich the Kid, Life's a Gamble. This is probably one of the least memorable mainstream rap albums of 2024, and in a year where Ice Spice and Gunna dropped, that is actually, it's legitimately kind of impressive. I gotta give the man credit where credit is due. This is just a terrible record. It's not got a single memorable moment on it. Some absolutely trash bars in some places. No really distinct flows. It just feels like an album that serves no real purpose. It doesn't allow Rich the Kid to step forward artistically in any way. It doesn't have any really catchy moments or really distinct pop-level kind of moments either. There's just nothing here. It's bloated, it's unmemorable, it's bland, it's just not good. It's just not good. Oh, hey, speaking of bland and not good, number 12, Gracie Abrams, The Secret of Us. You know, I would never say that I'm mad about an artist getting popular, even ones I don't like, because I think that being mad about something like that is stupid, and the public wants what the public wants, but at the same time, I don't think I've ever been so baffled about an artist getting as popular as Gracie Abrams. I mean, just, I don't get it. I don't understand it, at least with, like, Taylor Swift, who is also on this list, just you wait, and I have things to say about her, but even with someone like Taylor Swift, or even a comparable artist like, you know, maybe Phoebe Bridgers. Sorry, I don't mean to compare the very talented Phoebe Bridgers to Gracie Abrams, but I digress. More singer-songwriter, pop-oriented artists that are on the same level, if not slightly more popular than Gracie Abrams at this point. I get it. They have their own respective appeals, their own unique artistic identities. I could hear a song I've never heard by them in a cafe and be like, oh hey, that must be a new song by insert artist here. Gracie Abrams doesn't bring anything to the table. Her songwriting is absolutely awful and juvenile to an at times grating extent, with completely indistinct lyricism here that kind of defeats the whole purpose of her singer-songwriter, pop singer-songwriter archetype. Her vocal style leaves a lot to be desired in terms of actually coming across as anything unique that the mainstream pop scene doesn't already have at the moment, and the production here doesn't really bring anything to the table either. I mean, it's just generic pop production. There's no moments here that feel really emotionally explosive. There's nothing here that feels really sensitive or vulnerable. It's just an album by an artist that, you know, maybe some impact on her career was had by her father directing several of the Star Wars films and also multiple other extremely successful films. But hey, I didn't say anything. I'm not suggesting anything. I just think that maybe, you know, maybe nepotism's real sometimes, you know, or maybe people just really like bad music. Either way, it's sad either way. This is a terrible album. Number 11, Justin Timberlake, Everything I Thought It Was. I don't think it's controversial at this point to cite Justin Timberlake as being a relatively polarizing figure throughout the history of mainstream pop music in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, generally speaking, the guy has had some major ups and downs throughout his career, both commercially and in terms of public relations. But his latest studio album, Everything I Thought It Was, kind of had potential at first, in my opinion. It seemed like it was going to be a sort of musical, artistic retrospective of his career and maybe a comeback from the disaster that was Man of the Woods. But instead, it's actually just another disaster. So good job, I guess? I mean, this record really is just trying its absolute best to combine all of the dance and pop R&B and pop funk influences that have always been a part of Justin Timberlake's sound since he went solo from NSYNC, but I don't know, as a whole, it just sounds awful here. There's no real singular direction that they're going in, and for the more sort of sultry and suave cuts, he just does not have, for lack of a better term, any swag. This man does not have any sort of charisma going for him that really sells it, and it all comes across as a bit cringeworthy, made all the worse by the fact that this album is only slightly shorter than your average Hollywood A-list feature film. This is a nearly 80-minute long album, and it could have been 20, and it probably still would have made it on this list, but the fact that it's so bloated, so directionless, so meandering, it's just an obnoxious record to trudge through, even for the couple of alright songs that are on here. It's just not a pleasant listening experience, and if JT's last album didn't kill his mainstream pop career, then this probably will, I would imagine. Not that people really cared about this album, but you get my point. Number 10, Dragon Force, Warp Speed Warriors. Normally, I'm not the biggest power metal hater like a lot of other people are. I know that generally speaking, people consider it to be like the weakest subgenre of metal, and I think that's a shame. There's a lot of great power metal out there that people are missing out on by completely dismissing the genre, outside of the couple of more well-known and respected bands like Helloween and Blind Guardian. That being said, Dragon Force, if that was most people's first deeper introduction to power metal beyond just the most critically acclaimed bands that the subgenre's ever seen, I can get why you would just completely write it off. I mean, their early work is actually pretty fine for the most part, in my opinion, but their latest effort, Warp Speed Warriors, exemplifies everything wrong with them and the kind of power metal that they inspired. Sure, you could argue this is just meant to be corny, cheesy fun, but it's not fun. It's just corny and cheesy. The production here is flat. The instrumentation is so hard at times to even comprehend how flashy it is without any actual substance, songs that don't go anywhere, vocals that feel pretty limp in places, which almost kind of defeats the point of power metal in the first place, having unremarkable vocal work. I mean, come on, that's like Power Metal 101, please, Dragon Force, work with me here. And as a whole, not only do I think it's Dragon Force's worst work to date, but I also think it's just one of the weakest metal albums I heard all year. And if it weren't for just, like, one other album, it would easily be my least favorite metal album of 2024, if not just for the fact that it feels so unremarkable. It's just a bad album from a band that has gotten worse and worse as time has gone on, and they've continually shown their cracks more and more as a band, as a power metal band, and now I think we're at a major low point for them, creatively speaking. Number 9, Taylor Swift, The Tortured Poets Department. I know that people have basically talked about the Tortured Poets Department to death at this point, so I'm going to keep this short. The songwriting here is absolutely atrocious in its worst moments. The production here is completely bland. It feels like the color beige. That's the only way that I can describe it. Taylor's vocal work here isn't even really that memorable, not that she's ever been the best vocalist in the world outside of, the realm of just mainstream pop music. Even in current mainstream pop music, she's not a particularly great vocalist in the context of some of her peers, but I digress. There's just a lot of awful moments on this record, and as someone who doesn't really think of Taylor as the worst thing in the world or the absolute antichrist like some people do consider her to be, I can firmly say I think this is her worst album, and I can understand the hate as well. This is just terrible stuff. Awful. Number 8, Lil Dicky, Penis. Look, I know this album is technically a soundtrack to his show. I don't care. It's still awful. The show was also awful. I'm gonna talk about it in my worst of list anyway. This is Lil Dicky at his absolute worst, because not only is he no longer trying to even be remotely taken seriously as a rapper like he was in the past, not that that's a particularly good quality because all of his past work is absolute garbage as well, but he's trying so hard to be funny on this album, and the big issue is that he isn't. That's a big problem when people try to be funny, but then they're not. Trust me, I know, I try to be funny all the time, and I'm not. I understand. It sucks to experience. I'm sure it's bad for you. So imagine how I feel when I'm listening to this record. An album that really does try so hard to be comedic at times, but in its best moments ends up trying to be more genuine. But the thing is that for a brief second, there will be a song or two that comes across as earnest that's immediately thrown out the window by some sort of dumb rant that he goes on, or the umpteenth dick or boner joke that he makes on this album. And it gets so tired so incredibly quickly. Songs like Harrison Ave, for example, where he talks about this sort of complicated relationship he had with a girl named Brittany, and then immediately, like halfway through the song, he starts talking about how he didn't want to dance at a party that she was at because people were afraid that they were gonna see his boner. That's so funny. You've never talked about penis before. That's so original. You've never done that before. It feels like I'm listening to the musical version of, like, one of the later American Pie films. I'm not even gonna insult, like, the first one by comparing it to that. It's like one of the sequels. I mean, damn, dude. It's just a bad 2000 sex comedy in musical form. That's the best way I can describe this. Just an atrocious listening experience overall. Number 7, Eminem, The Death of Slim Shady. I wouldn't say that this record has quite as many awful bars as Revival or Kamikaze, and the beats aren't quite as bad as they were on Music to Be Murdered By, but it's still got some pretty awful bars, and the beats are still pretty terrible. But in particular, what really makes this record stand out as a bad album in the context of late-career Eminem, which is pretty consistently awful in the first place, is the fact that it wastes a genuinely kind of interesting idea. M has been on and off with bringing back the Slim Shady persona since he first stopped using him consistently decades ago, but I feel like that idea of bringing him back on this record just to kill him off is absolutely wasted here. I mean, it doesn't seem like he knows what to do with Slim Shady as a character at this point. And one could even argue that the entire concept of Slim Shady, this edgy, fuck society kind of figure that was extremely boundary pushing when he was first introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s in the context of mainstream rap, just doesn't hit the same anymore. I mean, whether it's M talking about his personal issues in some very obnoxious and at times absolutely god-awful bars throughout this record when he's playing himself, or taking up the Slim Shady mantle once again to deliver some takedowns of, like, different groups of people, or, like, talk about anti-woke stuff, or whatever, all, of course, you know, through the lens of sort of being post-ironic about it, and sort of using Slim Shady as this villain character, of course. It all just feels kind of indistinct in the current landscape of music in general. I mean, there's a million people that were influenced by Eminem's Slim Shady era doing exactly what he does now. So bringing him back at this point to deliver a bunch of verses from a character that M really hasn't worked with on a full-length project for years and years and years at this point, it all just comes across as a bit cringeworthy. And again, a lot of the songwriting here is absolutely terrible. There are some really god-awful bars on here, especially the, you know, P. Diddy line, that's kind of infamous now. It's not as bad as Kamikaze, it's not as bad as Revival, it's about as bad as Music to be Murdered By, which is, like, very bad. And I think the fact that this is probably the best out of those 4 albums, you know, from Revival to now, is really just testament to how awful Eminem has been since, like, mid-2010. Really, really phenomenal track record, honestly. Number 6, Post Malone, F1 Trillion. There's a lot of conversation surrounding Post Malone's shift to this very pop-oriented bro country kind of stuff, his appearance at the CMAs, etc., and what that means for him as an artist if he kind of just culture vultured his way through rap and hip-hop to eventually get to a predominantly white genre of music, and I think that's an important conversation to have, especially in the context of the modern mainstream pop rap scenes where a lot of white artists seem to be doing that. But what I think the most important conversation to have is how fucking bad this album is. Oh my god, it makes me want to die. I knew I wasn't going to like it going in because this bro country kind of stuff is never for me, and I don't think it's for most people who have the ability to hear sound and interpret it as music. But with that being said, this is some truly awful stuff. It makes me want to throw up and also burn alive at the same time, and the fact that it's Post Malone, an artist who I was never a huge fan of, but I always considered relatively respectable, it is kind of disappointing to see him go in a direction that is not only so not suited for him from an artistic standpoint, at least based on this record alone, but also just so utterly lifeless and dull. My god, awful record. Number 5, Ministry, Hopium for the Masses. Ooh, this is a rough one. Ministry have kind of always been a relatively political band, whether their fans want to admit that or not, or at least they have been for a long time at this point, and I don't think there's really any denying that on this record in particular, and it's just a shame that this is also one of their worst, if not their worst album period to date. I mean, man, this is a record that's disappointing in so many ways, but most of all based around the fact that it is so absolutely vague and spineless regarding its politics. I mean, there's so many ideas here that seem fine on paper or even positive from a messaging standpoint on paper that they just don't develop. I mean, Just Stop Oil, which is an environmentalist kind of song, not the first time industry's dealt with that, feels like a corny kids episode of a cartoon that is trying to talk about environmentalism and why you should trees are your friends. It doesn't feel like it has a developed perspective on anything at all. But worse than that are the more inherently political songs that are less about, just general issues and more specifically about societal issues. Songs about the invasion of Ukraine that feel exploitative of the topic and of the suffering of people in Ukraine rather than actually discussing it or analyzing it in any way. Songs like Aryan Embarrassment and Goddamned White Trash that seem to be talking about modern American politics in some form, but other than the very obvious perspectives that they're looking, at the topic from based on song titles, they don't really say anything. I mean, there's just some extremely vague leftist politics on this record, and while I probably would agree with most of the points that they are making here, I can't even say that I do, because I don't know what those points are. It's a record that has no direction lyrically, ideologically, and it's an album that feels just as dangerous as some of the stuff that they're rallying against on this record, supposedly, because none of the ideas, none of the points and concepts, the ideology here is just not developed. It's not in any particular way pointed in a singular direction other than just having some vague ideas of what they want to say. And again, that is just as dangerous as having the opposite opinions here that would, be sort of, I guess, what Ministry are going against. It's hard for me to even say that confidently because Ministry don't elaborate on what they're saying here. Songs like BDE, another big example, talking about toxic masculinity. And besides the fact that I never want to hear Al Jorgensen say the phrase big dick energy ever again, the use of this buzz term, this slang phrase that has already kind of died down since they originally used it when this record came out, it just feels like it cheapens the overall experience, and that's a perfect demonstration of this entire record, them constantly cheapening their own ideas by being vague about it, and then kind of just pushing that out as vague, mushy slop. That's the only way I can really describe this record. A major disappointment for sure, and that's saying a lot because I don't expect much from Ministry in 2024. Number 4. Pestilence, Levels of Perception. Speaking of older metal bands that were at one point some of the best of their kind before quickly fading into god-awful records that are now reaching their lowest of low points, Pestilence here with Levels of Perception, an album that combines maybe my two least favorite things in the world, AI cover art and albums where bands re-record their old songs because they don't have any ideas for what they want to put out next, but they feel the need to put out a new album. This is just a record that feels like the tiredest of the tired. I mean, I'm not going to get too deep into the staunch pro-AI stance that Pestilence have apparently taken, even though they took away the AI art for this album and replaced it with some other god-awful cover art because people understandably were mad at them for using AI in the first place. And since then, they've doubled down on the AI usage. But I digress. The music itself is absolutely awful. These songs did not need to be recorded. Most of them come from albums that range from solid to genuinely great. None of them needed a reinterpretation. And if they did, they certainly didn't need reinterpretations that are produced as horribly as this with nothing really new being added to them. They just sound like more sloppily put together versions of their original selves. I mean, this is a record that represents pure laziness above all else. And I'm not even saying that just because of the AI cover art and, that whole debacle. I'm saying that just in concept, this record, and records like this in general, quite frankly, just represent a complete lack of ideas, a complete lack of ambition. And I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with being out of ideas or not feeling as ambitious as you did 30 years ago. That's completely understandable. I don't expect any band, death metal or otherwise, to continue being as, ambitious as they were when they put out their sophomore album. But at the same time, why even waste your fan base's time with albums like this, where you re-record songs that don't need to be re-recorded, don't add anything to those songs as you re-record them, and then produce them even worse than they were 30 years ago? It's just an absolute travesty of a record, and certainly the worst metal album of 2024 for me. Just absolutely terrible, and it's a shame to see a record like this tarnish the already kind of fading legacy of Pestilence as a band that were once genuinely great many, many moons ago. Number 3. MGK and Trippy Red, genre, sad boy. I would love to make a crack about how, genre sad boy, they invented their own genre, sad boy, but also I regularly use rateyourmusic.com, a website that constantly tries to convince me that there are real genres called stuff like futuristic swag and porno grind, neither of which are real in my eyes. So I guess I would be a hypocrite if I mocked them for the title, but I wouldn't be a hypocrite if I mocked them for the music, because the music is absolutely awful. The production here is pretty awful, and that's about the best thing I can say about it, because other than that, you have MGK and Trippy Red, two of the worst mainstream artists active today, consistently in both of their respective solo discographies, so it's not a shock that when they come together to make one final project as a collaborative unit, assuming this is the final one that they do together anyway, that it would be bad. Shocking. Who would have thought? I mean, MGK in particular is awful here, as he's arguably the worst between the two of them. Especially him in particular on this record, I feel like is pretty terrible, because he's just so completely whiny and hard to empathize with. I mean, it just feels difficult to appreciate any of the songwriting here from an emotional standpoint, when the best that he can put forward is shit like, I hate that I grew up sad as a kid, then I grew up and got sadder again. Man, that I couldn't even call that Tumblr core poetry or anything like that, because that would be insulting 17-year-olds on Tumblr. That would be hurtful to people who aren't legally allowed to vote that write poetry on Tumblr. That's not a good sign for a man in his 30s. Trippy Red is not innocent here either, though. He is also absolutely awful. He has some, like, terrible flows and appearances, and more than anything, it just feels like both of them giving up on trying to be creative or unique or anything, and the final result is this EP that, despite being not even 30 minutes long, arguably feels like more of a slog than anything else that either have put out in the past, which is saying something, especially in Trippy's case, because he's put out some really long-ass projects that are really, really bad. So the fact that this is arguably the worst that either have ever done is absolutely amazing. An achievement, best thing we've done since the moon landing, maybe. Number 2. Falling in Reverse. Popular Monster. I said it in the original review, and I will say it again. Ronald Radke. Moving on. And now, number 1, my least favorite album, the worst album of 2024, Say Anything is committed. Or, sorry, ... is committed. That's more like it. I don't think any album made me cringe more in 2024 than Is Committed by Say Anything, the latest studio album from the somewhat well-liked pop-punk band that really hasn't gotten the same critical reevaluation as some of their peers from 20+ years ago. But when this is the kind of material that they're putting out now, I can kind of see why no one really talks about them in favor of, other bands like them from around the same era. My god, this one's bad. Let me just run through really quickly all of the awful qualities about it. And if you want to hear me talk about this in more detail, go watch my full-length review on it where I rip into it more, please and thank you. But Max Bemis' vocal work, absolutely atrocious here. It sounds like he's forcing out every single line. There's some really confusing production choices going on here. Everything sounds so muddy and indistinct. There's vocal tracks being layered on top of each other sometimes in ways that just feel so confusing. And worst of all, this album tries to be funny at points, and it's just not. There's this moment on the end of the track Woman Song where there's like this extended dialogue between Max and like this woman, and he's trying to, convince her of like how good the song that he just played her in the context of the story, was and stuff, and it's meant to be played for laughs, and I understand that, but it's just not funny. It's just not good. It's awkward. It's unpleasant. It's not even funny in an awkward, like, Tim and Eric kind of way or anything like that. It's just unpleasant to the deepest extent. Not to mention his songwriting, even when he's trying to be a bit more serious throughout this record, has all the maturity of, like, the biggest Funko Pop collecting 45-year-old man-child that you know. I mean, my god. There's some absolutely atrocious sex addict adjacent lyrics throughout this record on songs like I Vibrator, which is, meant to be like trying to make the world better for women by being better at having sex with them, which I thought was like him being jokey and post-ironic, which would have just been like cringy in the first place, but turns out he's like, I'm assuming serious about that, because he said in an interview, and I quote, it's about, quote, wanting to be objectified as a righteous tool against the patriarchy for a particular girl to use at will. I've been baffled by that since I read that back in May of 2024, and I'm still baffled by it to this very day as I film this video for you now. It's just an awful record. Virtually no redeeming qualities. The fact that it's as long as it is and it tries so hard to be like stadium level anthemic at times, it just doesn't work in any way whatsoever, and in turn, it's my least favorite album of 2024, and I never want to hear this album ever again, and I hopefully never will, because I don't think anybody really cared about it, except for me, and I only cared about it in like a bad way, so. And so, yeah, with that being said, that is my top 20 worst albums of 2024. Did you like some of these albums? Did you hate all of these albums and think that they were bad and awful and terrible and maybe even a little stinky? Let me know. Do you think that I should be shot and killed on spot next time I leave my house? Let me know, I guess. Hopefully not. But until then, next time I'm going to be doing my top 50 best albums of 2024, but yeah, that'll happen when it happens, like in a day or two, probably. But until then, thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.